Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining the Canadian Association of Social Workers today. My name is Roshni Korean, and I am the Education Coordinator here at the Canadian Association of Social Workers. Thank you all for joining us here today for today's webinar called Finding Our Way Home, a Photovoice project with young people aging out of care in Halifax. Before we begin today's session, I would first like to take a moment to acknowledge that the CASW is situated on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. First Nations, Inuit, and Métis Nations have been stewards of Turtle Island since time immemorial. We also remember those who were forced to come here, particularly those brought here because of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery. We recognize our complicity in settler colonial violence and honor our commitments to truth and repairing relationships. We welcome you to take a moment to reflect on the territories that you are tuning in from and the many nations and peoples who have cared for this land. Please do let us know in the group chat where you are tuning in from. Before passing the podium on to our presenter for the day, I will quickly go through some housekeeping formalities. Today's event will be 1 hour, 90 minutes, 1 hour for the presentation and roughly 20 to 30 for Q&A. And towards the end, we will address questions from the audience. Each of the widgets on your screen are adjustable in size and movable so that you can arrange your screen to suit your preferences. Live closed captioning in English and French is now available on the platform under the media player widget. I encourage you to type your questions in the Q&A box at any time during the presentation, and we will do our best to address them at the end of the discussion. The recording of this event will be available in 24 hours using the link that you signed up with, and a certificate of attendance will be emailed to you at the end of the presentation, or you can download it directly from the platform at the end of the event. And lastly, please be sure to fill out the survey that will appear at the end of the session as well. This webinar is presented in partnership with the Child Welfare League of Canada and the Canadian Research Network on Transitions to Adulthood from Care, otherwise known as CanTrack. CanTrack is the Canadian chapter of the Global International Research Network on Transitions to Adulthood from Care. Currently comprised of researchers primarily from Quebec and Newfoundland, CanTrack aims to grow its membership from coast to coast to coast. Today, our presenter from CanTrack is Dr. Melanie Doucet, who has been working to improve lives of youth in care for over 20 years. She is a former youth in care, holds a PhD in social work, and is an adjunct professor at the McGill University School of Social Work and a member of the CanTrack. She continues to work as part of the provincial and national youth in care advocacy community on child protection policy reform initiatives, and is currently leading the Equitable Transitions to Adulthood for Youth in Care project, alongside the National Council of Youth in Care Advocates, with the support of the Child Welfare League of Canada. Thank you so much, Melanie, and welcome. Please do take it away. We look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Roshni, for the introduction. Hello, everyone. I also want to do a land acknowledgement. I'm joining you today from Tsiutake, what is known today as Montreal. It's located on the traditional and unceded territory of the Mohawk Nation, who have been caring for the land and its people for time immemorial. The territory is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. While we're all joining this event virtually, it's important for each of us to reflect and also confront our own place on the land that we're situated on and on which we're able to engage in this work, whether that be treaty territory or unceded and stolen lands. We have to reflect on the history of the land that we're on and how we can contribute concretely to decolonization. Indigenous peoples have been significantly impacted by the colonial and assimilative policies and practices of the mainstream Canadian child welfare system, a system in which Indigenous children and youth are still overrepresented to this day. So in working for a better future for all youth in and from care, we must each recognize our role and responsibility in addressing the colonial harms against Indigenous peoples and work to uphold their sovereignty and rights. I'm going to put some resources for land acknowledgements and for finding out which territory you're situated on in the group chat. Feel free to share those in your day-to-day lives as well. So today I'm going to be presenting a collaborative Photovoice research project that I was fortunate in leading with young people who aged out of the child welfare system in the Halifax Regional Municipality and also experienced homelessness. So I will go into detail about why youth in care are overrepresented in the youth homelessness population in the next slides. Roshni, are these slides showing, is the slide 2 showing for the audience? Because I'm seeing maybe that I don't have a presenter control.
Passing control on.
I did just switch to presenter control. Now they get to see it.
Okay, great.
So yeah, perfect. Okay, problem solved. So I just want to emphasize that this project was led by myself and Elizabeth Clark, who was the research coordinator for this project. Elizabeth is a PhD student at Dalhousie University. I supervised from Montreal, and I also created the project as well as the ethics proposal that was submitted and approved by Dalhousie University. And I also want to acknowledge the co-researchers, because the youth who participated in this study are truly co-researchers in this project. This is how they chose to be officially recognized. Another kid in the system, Haley O'Neill, Nick Roca, Perseus, Riley Lucas, Celinda, V, and Sheila Lorenz. And this project was made possible via the support of the Resilience Research Center under the direction of Dr. Michael Unger at Dalhousie University, and was funded by Making the Shift. So just to give you a little bit of a background on the intersections between youth in care and youth homelessness. This was a study that was done back in 2015, the National Youth Homelessness Survey. They found that homeless youth are nearly 200 times more likely to have been involved in the child welfare system, or 61%. There's also a higher overrepresentation in that population of LGBTQS2+ youth who had been in care at 63%, and Indigenous youth who had been in care at 70%. They also found in BC that youth in care were twice as likely to have moved in the past year after they aged out of care than their peers. And the difference is pretty stark, 59% for youth who were in care versus 22% of youth of the same age in the general population. And in a Quebec study recently in 2022, they found that over a third of youth exiting care in Quebec experience at least one episode of homelessness within the first few years of leaving care. And this was something that was interesting in terms of their findings. They found that youth in group homes and residential care were more likely to experience homelessness at 44.3% than those who were in foster placements at 18.5%. And we could hypothesize that this could be due to the fact that group homes and residential placements are based on shift staff and not really forging long-term connections and supportive relationships, versus a foster placement. There might be a continuance of that relationship post 18 or 19. In terms of poverty, this was a study that was done in BC. They found that youth exiting care tend to begin their adulthood living below the poverty line. with a much higher reliance on social assistance than their peers. Here, the difference is very stark. 40% for youth exiting care versus 2.5% for youth in the general population in the same age range. An Ontario study found that nearly half, or 4 out of 10, youth exiting care are within the clinical range of borderline or high mental health difficulties. And the majority of those youth, 82%, were diagnosed with special needs. Another study from Ontario also found that the use and misuse of alcohol and illegal substances was higher for youth exiting care compared to their peers of the same age, and often started at a younger age. And this can be kind of correlated to trauma and unaddressed mental health and well-being needs. There's also a phenomenon termed in the literature as crossover youth. This is youth who have been involved in the child welfare system and also become involved in the youth criminal justice system. I did do a presentation in September for CASWI and the New Brunswick Association of Social Workers on this topic, on crossover youth. Feel free to go take a look into the archives. It's also available on demand. So there's a 1 in 6 chance for youth in care to be detained or sentenced to custody compared to 1 in 50 for youth in the general population. These are statistics from British Columbia. There's also an overrepresentation of Indigenous youth in care in the youth criminal justice system by over 500%. And this statistic is really sad. Youth in care are more likely to end up in the criminal justice system at 36% than to graduate high school at 26%. They are also likely to be young parents, and this is something that came up in the study where half of the youth co-researchers were also young parents or young parents to be. What this study found in BC was that young women in long-term care became pregnant at 4 times the rate of the general population. Another study based in BC found that only 30% of youth in care who experience homelessness report receiving help to plan their transition, and only 1/3 of the cohort that exits care every year accesses some form of post-majority supports. This is kind of surprising in a sense because BC has the most post-majority supports and programs from compared to the rest of the country, and has the highest age cutoff as well. It's up to the 27th birthday. But what this study found was that there's a lot of eligibility criteria attached to these various programs and services and agreements, and that a lot of youth can't fit into those boxes, and they tend to fall through the cracks. Another thing that can be hypothesized in terms of this finding is that some youth don't have good experiences while they're in the system. They might not have a good relationship with their social worker, and so they might want to just be free of the system when they turn 18 or 19 and decide that they don't want to sign on for these post-majority supports and programs. Oftentimes what happens is that they'll kind of leave without wanting to have anything to do with the system, but then they realize once they're in crisis that they actually do need help. And what tends to happen is that they don't have that option to come back because their case file is closed. Something to also keep in mind when we think about youth homelessness, and this is from 2016 census data, 62.6% of youth in the general population between the ages of 20 and 24 are still living with their parents. And I would say that statistic is most likely higher today, especially if we acknowledge post-pandemic realities and the increased cost of living and the housing crisis. Youth in care don't have that luxury of staying at home. They have to leave the system at the age of majority due to legislative cutoffs. Sometimes they do have that opportunity to stay in their foster placements, but that really varies from where you live in Canada. And it really is all dependent on if you actually have a really good relationship with your foster placement. A lot of young people move around a lot during their time in care from placement to placement and don't have the opportunity to build a really strong foundational relationship with their foster placements. So to talk about the study, we did Photovoice, and Photovoice uses photography as a research methodology, and I'll go a little bit into more detail about that. So the reason why I like to do research projects with the Photovoice methodology is because it really communicates sometimes messages that cannot be necessarily fully expressed in words. So it is true that an image is worth 1,000 words. It can convey emotions, and it really allows the audience or the viewer to see the world through the eyes of the young person. So in terms of what is Photovoice in a concrete way and participatory action research, which goes hand in hand with Photovoice, it's really about using photography and group dialogue to deepen an understanding of a community issue. And the focus for this project was on youth in care experiencing youth homelessness after they exited care. It is a group project, so it entailed group sessions that happened over the course of 14 weeks. We met every week for about 3 hours, and there was a whole process where co-researchers were able to receive training on photography techniques and photo voice, and come up with the photographs that represented their experiences and the messages that they wanted to come across to decision makers. What I also like about this research approach is that participants really become co-researchers in the process, and they represent their own lived experience versus having their stories told and interpreted by others, which tends to be more traditional ways of doing research and can be viewed as exploitive and colonial. It also empowers young people to use their voices, their stories, and their eyes to contribute new knowledge and also bring forth solutions. So that's what I like about the PAR approach is that, yes, we're identifying the issues, but we're also proposing concrete solutions for change. And the youth in care population is really the best to come up with those solutions because they know what works and what doesn't because they lived through it. So they should be treated as the experts on this topic and on their own lives. And another component that I really like about this type of research approach is that it engages the public and key decision makers, because at the end of the project, you do a photo exhibit, whether in a community center or an art gallery, and then you invite the media, politicians, ministers, the community, family and friends, and it really raises public and political awareness on the issue. So just to give you a sense of who the youth co-researchers are, there are 8 who were able to stick through the whole project for the 14 weeks. In terms of gender, we had 2 who identified as male, 1 as non-binary, and 5 as female. The age range was between 19 and 26, with 2 young people between the ages of 19 and 21. We had 2 who were age 23, and then 4 who were between the ages of 24 and 26. In terms of ethnicity, we had 3 young people who identified as Indigenous, 1 as African Canadian, and 4 as Caucasian. And in terms of other identities, we had 1 young person identify as LGBTQ2S+, and we had half, so 4 out of 8, who were young parents, either currently young parents or were pregnant and were parents to be. So these are the research questions that we examined through this study. First, we wanted to look at the pathways through the child welfare system that were most likely to help young people develop the resources that they needed for success, and which were more likely to predict precarious housing. We wanted to look at the risk and protective factors that influence their patterns of resilience and homelessness. And we also wanted to see if the background of the young people were influencing their access to protective factors or not. And then we also wanted to make sure that we were developing concrete recommendations for policy practice and programs and services. So this is why we included that into the process of the research project with the co-researchers. So we divided the findings across 4 major categories. The first are the protective factors. And the second, we found some factors that were kind of both protective and risk factors, and I'll go into more detail about that. And then we presented risk factors, and then the recommendations for practice, policy, and support and services. So in terms of protective factors, I'm not naming all of them today because it would take much longer than an hour presentation. We do have a full report that was published. I will provide the links to that at the end of the presentation. So these are kind of the most recurring ones that came out through the thematic analysis that we did together of all the photographs and the group discussions that happened on a weekly basis. So comforts, hope, community, and self-care were some of the most recurring protective factors that came up through the photography and group discussions. This photograph relates to comforts. It's untitled, and it's by Shayla Lorenz. Shayla describes the photo. This photo symbolizes the bright beauty that we can find in life if we look for it. Small moments, small things can give you moments of joy. So the group described comforts as tangible, reality-based comforts, such as flowers, plants, photos, and animal companions. They also talked about disassociative comforts, such as playing video games, connecting to film characters, and escaping reality by watching movies, and holding on to memories of deceased loved ones. They also talked about comforts being used to generate feelings of hope in difficult times, as well as to help celebrate successes. So gifting to self, to kind of self-acknowledge some successes of being able to, for example, get a job or get into school or find housing supports, for example. This photo is related to hope. It's untitled. It's by Celinda Tusnard, and they describe the photo as such. I just really had a really negative self-image for a long time. Like I had given up hope for myself. I didn't think I was worth fighting for, so I just gave up and let myself go. Then I came out of it, of the slump. I decided I wanted to have a better life, so I started to fight for myself. And this notion of hope was connected to their ability to find housing after experiencing homelessness. They said that they found hope by getting encouragement from others in seeking help and getting out of the situations that they were from. But they also said they found hope in giving encouragement to others who may be in a similar situation that they had found themselves in. They also mentioned, especially the young parents and those who were expecting parents, that learning about a pregnancy actually shifted things for them, and they wanted to fight for a brighter future for their children. The feelings of hope, of worthlessness that a lot of the youth talked about while they were experiencing homelessness It contributed to accepting homelessness and thinking that they deserved it, whereas hope increased self-esteem and allowed them to begin seeking housing options. And I'll talk about this a little bit later, but oftentimes that feeling of worthlessness was ingrained in them throughout their time in care because they had, I guess, complacent social workers who weren't prioritizing them, and also really negative foster placement experiences where they weren't treated with dignity and they were actually treated really differently when it came to, for example, the foster placement's biological children. This photo is about community, and it's titled Flowers by Another Kid in the System. Getting to where I am now was a true battle I fought every step of the way, sometimes with some help from a friend. The yellow flower was gifted to me by a tutor when I graduated from my program at NSCC. The pink flowers I brought for myself. The youth talked a lot about personal heroes or champions in their lives, people who really chose to go above and beyond their job description or professional role to truly make a difference in the lives of the youth. Some of these people were, for example, workers of community nonprofit organizations, school counselors, tutors, municipal employees such as bus drivers, just people who took kind of a caring role that a family member traditionally would, and really took on the role of protector and advocate for that young person. Something that the youth also mentioned in terms of community, they said that they would feel more of a sense of community and inclusion in a tent city, so in an encampment, than in a homeless shelter or in a foster family or group home. This photo is related to self-care. It's titled Determination by Perseus. I always carry a picture of my deceased father with me in my wallet. It reminds me to do right by him and to keep going. So the youth talked about self-care a lot and how it was a protective factor, and this included animal companions. They saw having a pet as contributing to their emotional well-being and self-care, carrying photos to remind them of lost loved ones, buying themselves treats, rewards, or having tokens to encourage themselves to take action or progress in their lives. The next theme has to do with kind of those factors that fell both into protective and risk factors. And there were two that came up in that regard, work and space. So this photo is related to work. It's titled, Why Don't You Get a Job by Haley O'Neill. I always worked. I would show up for work at the mall on time every day and work my ass off, and this other girl would be late and say her alarm didn't go off. But she had a home with a bed and an outlet to plug her phone into, and she couldn't show up on time. I think it's important to emphasize that almost all youth, 6 out of 8, were employed while they were homeless. They were simply not able to make enough money to be able to afford rent because the cost of housing in Halifax is quite high. One youth expressed great frustration that she did everything right. She pursued college trades education after completing high school, always worked hard, worked a job while she attended school, but she still didn't make enough to afford a place to live. So I think that's something important to remember because there tends to be this bias and stereotype associated with homelessness that it's about laziness and giving up and most often it's not. It's really not. It's about systemic barriers that prevent the young people to be able to access housing and to access the supports that they need. This one is connected to space. The photo is titled Sleep Tight by Vanessa Carberry. I spent many days and nights trying to find peace, sleeping on a bench near a bus stop. I'd pick the ones less stopped at, as I would be left alone and forgotten about in plain sight. This was something that the youth talked a lot about, that spaces could be safe and hostile at the same time. Some safe spaces that they mentioned were public benches, coffee shops, tent city or the encampments, public staircases, movie theaters, which were oftentimes the only places that were open during the holidays when shelters and support services were closed, and also friends' homes when they were able to couch surf. Some hostile spaces were entrances or lobbies to public buildings, the harsh outdoor elements when it came to especially winter season, and also the homeless shelters. A lot of the youth said those were not safe places. They were overcrowded and oftentimes not youth focused. So youth and adults would be kind of mixed together. They also talked about concerns over what they called being disappeared, which was referring to like being abducted or murdered if they were in a public space that was too secluded. So they had a hard time trying to find even a public space that was safe for them to sleep in when they had nowhere else to go. Some of the most common risk factors that came up, intergenerational experiences, meaning that their involvement in child welfare and or homelessness was an intergenerational one. So their parents had been involved in the system or in homelessness before. Domestic violence, and that was also intergenerational for some, where they experienced it at their family of origin and then experienced it again once they were in care and with a partner. Mental health and substance use was also a major factor, a risk factor, negative self-image, and community apathy. This one is tied to intergenerational experiences. It's titled Gotcha by Haley O'Neill. I overdosed on Tylenol when I was 17 and almost died. My dad did the exact same thing. He OD'd when he was 17. So I guess I'm stepping in his footsteps. All of the youth in this study, so all 8 of them, had intergenerational experiences and links to the social services system. They had parents who either struggled or were still struggling with homelessness, parents who struggled with or still struggling with addictions, mental health issues, suicide attempts, and also experiences of domestic violence. One youth had a child who was now in foster care, so that intergenerational experience was continuing. This photo is connected to domestic violence. It's untitled, quite self-explanatory, by Shayla Lorenz. Domestic violence was identified as a major risk factor for the majority of the youth co-researchers, so 6 out of 8. They became homeless or criminalized because of ongoing domestic violence against them or in their parental home, and sometimes both. One youth disclosed that they stayed with an abusive partner so that they would not become homeless again. So they had to kind of pick between the abuse and not having a roof over their head. And one co-researcher disclosed that they were charged and convicted of assault on their partner after defending themselves after experiencing months of physical and emotional abuse perpetrated against them by their partner. The quote from one of the youth co-researchers who talked about the experiences of domestic violence. You shouldn't have to stay with someone just to have a place to stay. I lost my son into foster care because her partner was violent and I had nowhere else to go. The police just come flying in with no idea what's going on. If they would have looked him up just for 1 minute, they would have seen that he's hurt me so many times, but instead they arrested me. This one's related to mental health and substance use, titled Medicare by Riley Lucas. Self-medicating with weed because I can't afford mental health medication. This was a huge struggle for most of the youth co-researchers, 7 out of 10. A lot of them lost their health coverage after they exited care, and so they had difficulty accessing even the prescribed medication that they needed. A lot of the youth also talked about the harmful side effects of hastily prescribed medication. They felt like they weren't given enough attention and priority by the medical professionals that they saw, and that oftentimes they would just kind of quickly get prescribed medication instead of delving further into their trauma and potentially seeing if they have PTSD, for example. They also talked about receiving no follow-up once they got those hastily prescribed medications, and so not able to communicate the fact that they were having harmful side effects and probably should have been changed on a different kind of medication. A lot of the youth struggled to gain access to mental health medication that they were prescribed, and that often caused them to enter into mental health crises. The youth also talked about feeling like their minds were different from the rest of the population, and I think that was connected to their shared childhood trauma experiences and their time in the child welfare system that also carried further trauma. This one is also connected to mental health and substance use. It's titled Hole in the Bottle by B. While I was homeless, I would drink every day. I became heavily addicted to alcohol. I would tell myself it was just to keep my body from freezing on a cold night. It turned into much more than that. So again, resorting to masking not just physical symptoms of battling the outdoors and the elements, but also masking trauma. This one is tied to negative self-image. It's titled Shattered by Celinda Tosnard. Feeling broken comes in more ways than one. Sometimes life leaves you feeling shattered. About half of the youth co-researchers talked about negative self-image really impacting their ability to get out of homelessness. They had this sense of unworthiness that resulted in temporarily ceasing to seek housing options. They talked a lot about having a moment where they gave up on themselves. This one is tied to community apathy, identified by the majority of the youth co-researchers. This photo is titled Trash by Nick Roca. How the world views you when you're homeless. They talked about the lack of concern from the general public when they would be outside and sleeping outside or spending time outside because they didn't have a place to live. They said they can't see us, or they won't see us, or they pretend they don't see us. People are just busy doing their own thing. They also constantly feared acts of hostility and harm from the public. A lot of the youth talked about being treated differently by their foster family versus the biological children of the foster family. So they felt like they weren't really prioritized and cared for. They also talked about the apathy and apathetic reactions and engagement that they had from their social workers. And some of them talked about being brought from their group homes to shelters after they turned the age of 16. They said it was like a dumping process that happened, and it was more common than you would think. This was a photo related to community apathy, but also related to community as a strength factor as well. It's titled Tent City by Haley O'Neill. It looks beautiful, almost peaceful. People just walk on by, quietly judging and not wanting to see the person. And this is something that's becoming more and more common in encampments as we see the housing crisis increase and worsen across the country. So now we're moving into recommendations. Looking at the recommendations for practice, they talked about better oversight and vetting of foster families. They also talked about needing more consistent social workers, so social workers that actually prioritize them and see them regularly. They also talked about the need for regular check-ins and safety assessments on the family of origin. A lot of them talked about how that wasn't done when they were living at home, and that they would have benefited from regular check-ins from social workers. Sometimes some of them got placed into care and then returned back home before coming back into the system. And they said that their safety wasn't really assessed at those times. And so it caused the placement back at home to fail. So this is related to the foster placement vetting. A lot of the youth talked about this. Here are a few quotes that I want to share with you from the youth. They are terrible people. They were just in it for the money. They would treat their own children one way, then not give us anything. They would lock us outside in the rain for hours in our cold rubber boots. Another youth shared, I was left outside for hours. I was cold and alone, and they wouldn't let me back in, so I started yelling. I kept yelling, but then they called the cops. The cops came, then they left, and I was homeless. So all of the youth co-researchers, all 8 of them, experienced homelessness while they were still in care. Their placement, whether it was foster care or in a group home, had failed, and that was the result of their homelessness. They talked about the placements. They need to be better vetted. They also need better training, and they need better oversight during their time in care as well. This is related to the need for more consistent social workers. The photo is titled Cell Phone Case by another kid in the system. Throughout my time in the care of Child Protective Services, my social worker and legal guardian changed so often. I was a number in a work phone that was unceremoniously passed from worker to worker. So a lot of the youth talked about the high turnover of social workers. This was a common experience across all of them. One youth who had been in care since they were young estimated they had over 100 different workers throughout their entire time in the system. They talked about regular meaningful checks on their well-being not happening during their time in care, and this often caused a breakdown in placement and propelled them into homelessness. They also talked about their workers not ensuring that they were meeting certain developmental milestones, like knowing their rights, knowing how to be social and interact with other young people, knowing how to have conversations with employers, landlords, and so on. They also talked about the traumatic experiences that they had to go through when they had to rediscuss their life journey with each new social worker. When you've had to do this 100 times, I can only imagine. It's really re-traumatizing the young person to have to retell their story and their trauma to every single different worker. Recommendations specific to policy also came up. Again, these are not all of them. You can consult the report for those, but these are the most recurring ones. Improving access to existing funds and services for youth in care, providing immediate access to rent subsidies, and they emphasize that emergency shelters do not constitute adequate housing and that this should not be a policy. This is related to the struggle in accessing services. It's called Realistic Progress by Another Kid in the System. Because a place to stay is progress, but you can't afford to make it a home right away. I got my dog, Zeus, just before starting my program at NSCC. You can see in the photo that the mattress is on the floor still. A lot of the youth talked about struggling to access the services that they were actually eligible for, such as funds for housing, schooling opportunities, housing supports. They said long wait lists and bureaucratic red tape were huge barriers in them being able to access these supports in a timely manner. They said that community organizations often ended up helping them to fight for access to these services, but this process still often took months or even years, and oftentimes these types of things made them fall through the cracks, because when a young person seeks help, it's for an immediate need and not months or years from now. They talked about rent subsidies in Nova Scotia not being available immediately when a young person exits care. Oftentimes the wait process has to contribute to their homelessness. So some of them were talking about like having to wait until their 19th birthday to be able to even apply for the rent subsidy. And sometimes they needed that rent subsidy way before their 19th birthday. This one's related to youth shelters not being, not youth shelters, shelters in general, not being appropriate placements. This photo is titled "A House That Holds 100 Heads" by Nick Roca. Imagine being one of 160 people sleeping on cots in this building. Like I mentioned earlier, the youth shared that it was actually an unspoken common practice that youth over the age of 16 who couldn't remain in their parental home and weren't in a foster home or group home, they were dumped at a youth homeless shelter. And sometimes even kids over the age of 16 that came into care at that age were also dumped at the homeless shelter instead of being placed in a formal placement. They said it was a really demoralizing and traumatizing experience because, again, they were placed with adults who had been on the streets for a long time. There was a lot of violence in those settings, and they said it was just not appropriate for a young person to be in. So these recommendations have to do with supports and services. The youth talked about the need for a guaranteed level of life skills training before they exit the system. They also talked about housing supports specifically for victims of domestic violence, and also the need for guaranteed access to mental health support and medication, even after the age of majority. So this was related to life skills. One of the youth shared Nobody even noticed I didn't know how to interact with other children properly. So a lot of the youth talked about how there was not really a person in their lives who ensured that they acquired the necessary skills to succeed as they transitioned to adulthood. They often felt they had insufficient social skills like conversation skills, the ability to interact with others in a comfortable way. They also talked about insufficient hard skills, such as not knowing how to file tax returns, not knowing how to complete forms when they had to apply for supports and services, not really understanding the language, and really not knowing exactly how to navigate all the different systems for the resources and services that they were eligible for in the community. So this one again is related to the life skills aspect. It's Untitled by Shayla Lorenz. I couldn't manage my emotions and didn't know what to do except run away. So I think that's something really important to remember, is that symptoms of trauma will come forward in different ways for different youth. Some will internalize, they won't know how to express themselves, so they'll become really quiet, really reserved, and block off people because they don't trust them, and they'll run away. And then other youth will be the opposite. Well, they don't know how to express their emotions, so they express it with anger, sometimes even violence, and then they end up being thrown out or sometimes even charged by the police because of their behavior and criminalized. This is certainly something that I saw myself. I worked as a youth worker, very short-lived time, about 5 months in a group home. It was a crisis unit. And I saw this happen way too often, where a young person was clearly going through psychotic episodes because they were on a cocktail of medications that just weren't working for them. And they also didn't know how to express themselves, and were frustrated. And they would either attack a staff member or punch a hole in the wall. And the first recourse was to call the police and charge them, instead of doing more kind of crisis de-escalation, and looking at it from a trauma-informed lens and providing appropriate supports. This one has to do with victims of domestic violence and how housing and support specifically for them is really important. The photo is not titled, by Shayla Lorenz. The police make it so we are the enemy. Then when we need them, we don't have anyone to call. So this was something that a lot of the youth talked about, that they need support when they're experiencing domestic violence to remain housed while being physically, emotionally, and psychologically safe, because they shouldn't have to choose between having a roof over their head and or staying with an abusive partner. It shouldn't be that choice. They said that having safe housing would have prevented so much more trauma that they experienced. This one's related to the guaranteed access to mental health supports and medication. It's Untitled by Celinda Tosnard. Everyone can see it's broken, but nobody is going to take the time to fix it because it doesn't matter enough. This was something a lot of the youth talked about. They had significant mental health struggles. A lot of them were diagnosed with ADHD. They also had anxiety, feelings of depression. They had experienced suicide ideation, suicide attempts, and also self-destructive behaviors such as cutting, for example. They talked about the need to have access to guaranteed and routine mental health services, and also access to the medications that they were prescribed, and the ability to have follow-ups with medical professionals when these prescribed medications aren't really working for them. And finally, a few more recommendations for supports and services. Formalizing the role of a long-term support person or a natural mentor is how it's termed in the literature. And maintaining connections with extended family, friends, and other social supports during their time in care. This was something that came up as a strength factor, having a person of trust in your life, a champion. And they said that that really needs to be something that is nurtured during their time in the system, and that those types of relationships need to be forged. It shouldn't be left up to chance for a young person to meet someone like that in their community. They also talked about the continuous social disruptions that they experienced during their time in care because of the removal from their family of origin, and also changing placements all the time. They said that disrupted the bonds that they were starting to forge. Sometimes they had to change schools as well, and that really disrupted their friend circle, for example. So they talked about the importance to maintain relational continuity. They also talked about the importance of placing siblings together whenever possible. A lot of them got separated when they got placed into care. And again, that created further trauma and displacement and feelings of isolation. This is something that I've seen also in some of the studies that I've done prior to this one, where siblings don't get placed together, and sometimes it creates rupture in the relationship that will not ever be able to be repaired. That's something that a few youth shared with me in a previous research. So I also want to emphasize that all of these findings tie into a project that I'm currently working on with the National Council of Youth and Care Advocates, called the Equitable Standards for Transitions to Adulthood for Youth in Care. If you're not familiar with this project and with the Equitable Standards, I highly encourage you to go on the Child Welfare League of Canada's website and read the reports that we've published. But what we're really advocating for with the Equitable Standards is for solutions to be youth-led. So this was developed by myself and the National Council, who's comprised of people with lived experience from across the country, and to really look at the needs of young people in a holistic way instead of a siloed way. So I think that's why we're seeing the outcomes that we're seeing, because the needs of young people are being addressed in a very siloed approach, and also in a way that there's no kind of guaranteed level of support and services that youth receive. It really varies based on even the community that you live in, but even more so from province to province and territories, because of the different legislation and age limits that are in place. So what we're advocating for is that there needs to be standards when it comes to supports to for the transition to adulthood for youth in care, and that standard cannot be kind of crumbs, bottom of the barrel, which is kind of what young people in care are receiving now. It needs to be a gold standard of guaranteed supports and services, so that young people from care are supported in a way where they get the chance to actually succeed and thrive in life, instead of being caught in these cycles of survival and barely making it, and sometimes not making it. So this is really what we advocate for through the Equitable Standards. We have a whole pillar that's dedicated to housing, and we have key supports listed under each pillar to illustrate what needs to be in place to be able to meet those standards. These key supports have been validated by young people currently in care and who have recently left care from all over the country. So really, this is what we are advocating for. So please go take a look. That can certainly influence your policies and practice when it comes to meeting the needs of young people from care in a holistic way and preventing their involvement in homelessness. So I'm going to end it here. I'll open it up for questions and comments. We do have a photo ebook that was published. So I only showed you some of the photos that were shared by the youth for this project, but we do have a photo ebook that has all of the photos and the captions. We also have a full report that came out in May. I encourage you to go read it. It has all of the findings. I only presented you kind of a snapshot today or a summary. And we also have a couple pieces in the media from when we did the photo exhibit at the Halifax Public Library in January. So there's also a QR code to access all these resources that you can use from your screen. We also have a link tree. That's where the QR code will take you. The link tree is called Finding Our Way Home. So thank you so much. I'm going to open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Doucet, for that incredible presentation on the Finding Our Way Home Photovoice project. It was incredibly inspiring when you went through like the particular photos and the descriptions of them, and hearing the youth voices was very moving. So we do have a few questions here from the audience that we'll just go over. And as we're going through the Q&A, I'd like to encourage audience members, if you do have any questions, to please type them out in the Q&A box. Thank you. So the first question is, how did you recruit the youth who participated in the project? And how do you think that might have impacted the findings of the study?
Yeah, we actually recruited via the community, mostly via email and electronically via social media posts. We recruited mostly successfully out of the Phoenix program, which is a program in Halifax that works specifically with youth experiencing homelessness. So most of the youth who participated in the study were accessing supports and services through Phoenix. I would say that probably did impact the population, I guess, of this study, because we weren't necessarily able to reach those like harder to reach youth who are like more entrenched, I guess, in the streets and in the encampments, for example, or maybe even more hidden than that. So those experiences aren't necessarily reflected in the findings of the study. I will also emphasize that 7 out of the 8 youth got out of homelessness either before the study took place or while the study took place because they were involved with Phoenix program. And one of the youth was still homeless by the end of the study.
Okay, so if all the youth were involved in the Phoenix project, which I think you said was based in Halifax, does that mean that all the youth co-researchers originally were from the Halifax area as well? And did you see anything come up in the findings about rural versus urban in terms of access to services and supports? So within Halifax, of course, being like a key urban area, and what would be, what does the research or findings say about being within the city and versus in rural spaces?
Yeah, so we did have a few youth who came from outside of Halifax, from rural areas, but they were placed in Halifax when they got removed from their family of origin because of the lack of supports and services and available placements. One of the youth who came from a rural area was the one who was still homeless after the end of the project. And one of the reasons for that, it was also the only young person, the only co-researcher who didn't have a champion in their life. They talked about how they felt they were deprived of that opportunity because they were removed from their community of origin, rural community, and it really like ripped their social support system apart, and they weren't really able to reconstruct it during their time in Halifax. So I think those rural to urban realities is a good question, because it's a reality that faces a lot of provinces and territories, and Nova Scotia specifically, where it's a pretty good divide between urban and rural communities. I think we need to do a better job at that, and I think resourcing community-based organizations that are in those communities with funding to be able to create programs or maybe establish similar programs to what are in some urban areas would be really beneficial. I also think using video conferencing. I don't know why, for some reason, pre-pandemic, we weren't using video conferencing as much as we do now, but that tool is now at our fingertips. And I think especially for like specialized services where you have to go to an urban area to kind of receive that, if it's appropriate to do it over a virtual meeting, then that's something that we should be looking more into, so that you're not displacing a young person from their whole community and sense of belonging just to receive a specialized service. So that would be a recommendation.
Nice. A critical one for accessibility and just for, being able to access key resources for sure. So you mentioned the mentor and champion program just now. Could you talk a little bit more about that? The mentors and the champions that the youth highlighted, and how that was a key strength factor in getting them out of homelessness.
Yeah, so again, this is something that they kind of talked about as like them being lucky that they found someone that cared about them in that way. And their recommendation was basically saying like it shouldn't be left up to luck that you encounter someone that cares about you in that way and that wants to fight for you. It should be really something that's built into your plan while you're in the system and nurtured throughout, so that when you're exiting care, you already have that really solid social support network filled with people who care about you and aren't necessarily paid to care about you either. I think that ties into like permanency planning, how we need to kind of shift the way of thinking, because traditionally permanency planning is focused on legal permanency, so like adoption. And it oftentimes misses that whole relational permanency component. And oftentimes older youth in care aren't seen as like viable adoptions because they're too old. And so they miss that opportunity to experience any form of permanency. So I think looking at permanency and planning for it as soon as a young person enters care from a relational aspect is really important. And that's what will help to create that social support network that they so much need. Because I will say for myself, from my own lived experience, one of the reasons why I never ended up on the streets, I did couch surf for quite some time, but the reason that I had a couch to crash on was because of my social support network. And it was because I was lucky in a sense, where I had a lot of friends and their parents who really cared about me and didn't want to see me, suffer and be outside. So I always had a place to go to. And I had people who had my back when the times got tough, and they did get tough. So again, I cannot emphasize that enough. It shouldn't be left to luck or chance for a young person to have people like that in their lives who care about them and have their backs, and are kind of a safety net when things go wrong. It should be really embedded into the process and kind of guaranteed that they will have people like that in their lives, just like any young person in the general population gets to have through family, extended family, chosen family, community, and so on.
Yeah, that's a critical recommendation. Absolutely. Feeling like you belong to a community, feeling like you're loved by people in your life. That's absolutely critical for sure. So we are nearing the end of our Q&A session. We do have one more question. If there are additional questions, we do have some additional time, so please do type them in the Q&A box. But otherwise, I will ask this final question, and then we will be able to wrap up a little early today. This final question is, what would be some key housing solutions that could be put into place that align with the equitable standards that you referred to?
Yeah, we have a full list. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. I was just wondering if you could speak to some of the key points of the equitable standards as well for those unfamiliar with them.
Yeah, so I'm just going to bring back this slide of the equitable standards. So we do have a whole pillar that's dedicated to housing, and the standard that's associated with that is that every young person should have a place they can call home without strict rules and conditions to abide by. And what we mean by that is like rules and conditions that are above and beyond what a youth in the general population would be expected to abide by in a rental agreement, for example. Because oftentimes what happens for youth in care who are in transition to adulthood, the transitional housing programs are tied to further institutionalization. So they get over surveilled, they have these really unrealistic conditions and curfews and all of that to abide by to kind of provide conditional housing. And it really needs to be unconditional housing when it comes to young people. We also advocate for housing to be a human right and not a commodity. And that's something that is really crucial to the housing pillar as well. One of the most promising programs out there is Housing First for Youth. If you're interested to learn more about that, the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness and Away Home Canada have some research on it, as well as a guide on how to implement a Housing First for Youth program. It's basically a wraparound housing program that really falls in line with what we're advocating for with the equitable standards. So yes, it provides a roof over your head that's safe and clean and in a neighborhood that's also safe, but it also provides wraparound services. So like a support worker, mental health services, financial support, help if you want to pursue your education or get your GED and think about college or post-secondary afterwards, help with employment. It connects you to the community. Also thinking about like culture and spirituality for, especially for Indigenous, Black, and racialized youth, connecting them to their culture, their communities of origin. Mental health is also a huge aspect in Housing First for Youth, and also equipping young people with the ability to understand what they have a right to and being able to self-advocate for that. And also, because it's a youth-centered and specific program, it's also developmentally appropriate to that population. Because again, that's something that we saw in this study, was that they were being placed into adult shelters and they were like, that is so not appropriate for where I'm at in my life right now. And also for, you know, the trauma that I carry in the place that I'm in right now in my life. So Housing First for Youth is a really good model to look at implementing in your communities and in your provinces and territories. And there was also a pilot that was done by Away Home Canada. I think they're going to be releasing a report on it soon. They piloted it specifically with youth exiting out of care. So please stay tuned for that on the Away Home website. They should be publishing it either at the end of this year or early into the new year. But a lot of promising data on that as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that very in-depth answer. Yeah, for those who are unfamiliar with the equitable standards, CASW did do a webinar in partnership with the Child Welfare League of Canada on the standards. So feel free to check that series out on our website for more information. And you can also Google the report as well. And we do have one more question that came in. Could you say a little bit more about how the co-researchers were involved in the project and how they felt about their involvement in the project?
Yeah, so we did have a debrief session with them after the research concluded. So after the photo exhibit happened, not all of them ended up showing up, but we were able to give them back their canvases because their photographs were canvassed for the photo exhibit, so they were able to get that back. We also had guest books at the photo exhibit for people who came in to view the photographs to kind of sign and give their thoughts and impressions on their art. And we had a few youth who also were able to make it for the photo exhibit. They weren't all able to. I think there was 3 of them who were able to make it. And there were politicians that showed up, and they were able to talk to them directly about their photographs and their experiences. And also the media showed up as well, so they were able to participate in media interviews. From what we were told at the debrief session and also after the photo exhibit event, is that the youth really appreciated how they were able to kind of speak for themselves and really own their story. Something that tends to not happen when you're just filling out a survey or even like doing a one-on-one interview. That's kind of one shot and done. So a lot of the youth talked about how they appreciated that. I have done Photovoice studies prior to this one. My doctoral research, I did it in Vancouver with youth who aged out of care, and we looked at relationships specifically. And the youth there were very engaged in every aspect, like the photo exhibit, they were all there. The media interviews, a lot of them wanted to be engaged in that. And I even continued being in touch with them whenever I had like conference presentations that were in BC to do. I invited them to come do a workshop with me. We presented to the Child and Youth Advocates Office together, and some of them even chose to co-write a journal article with me on the power behind participatory approaches when it comes to people with lived experience. So I think there's a lot of power behind this type of approach. I think the effects can sometimes be seen later on too, because I think it might be a bit of a whirlwind for 14 weeks for these young people when they haven't really had the time to sit down and reflect like this before. That's definitely something that was brought up both in my doctoral study and this study, where, you know, they just never had the chance to sit and think about like what happened to them and what could have been better. And, you know, how would I talk to a government official if I had the chance to give them recommendations? So I think that's a huge benefit of this type of study. But yeah, this is something that I'm hoping I get to do, you know, further into my career as well, because I love doing this type of research with young people, because it not only, you know, comes and takes data like traditional research, but it also gives them tools to kind of self-reflect on their experiences and maybe shift from feeling like a victim or feeling worthless to feeling empowered to advocate for themselves and to advocate maybe even on behalf of others, and to see that, hey, I'm actually an expert in this topic. And also seeing themselves as artists, for example, because they get taught how to use a camera and how to do photography. Some from my other project decided to pursue that further afterwards because they just kind of developed a love for it. So I just love doing these types of projects. And as someone with lived experience myself, it's just even more meaningful to be able to kind of give back to the community in that way, and just kind of leave behind at least things that they can take with them into their adulthood, and things they can see that there's actually something happening with the findings of the study as well.
Yeah, Photovoice methodology is so innovative. This is actually, I think, the first time I'm hearing about it in such detail. So I'm very amazed and intrigued by this as a research methodology. And it just, seems extremely innovative and very inclusive and very grounded in like the youth's lived experience. So thank you so much for sharing the results of this project with us, and for sharing some of the stories as well. We really appreciate it, Dr. Dusay.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we have neared the end of our presentation, and I want to give a huge thank you to Dr. Melanie Dusay for presenting this webinar on the Finding Our Way Home Photovoice project. Again, for our audience, the recording of this presentation will be available in 24 hours, or you can use the link in your email. Feel free to send us your questions, suggestions, or improvement for feedback using the survey, which will appear right after this webinar ends. And another huge thank you to all of our guests for joining us and our audience for your questions and your attention. We will see you next time for the next sessions. We have 2 more sessions, and so please do register for those at the CASW website. Take care, everyone. Have a great day. Bye.